Everyone, this is Tony Costa from Toronto Apologetics. So glad that you can come along. I'd like to encourage you, as always, to subscribe to Toronto Apologetics. It's absolutely free. And we also ask that you like and share the video as well. So from time to time, I usually get some questions from my viewership audience. And I've been putting out a series of videos on answering some of these questions. And so if you look at my channel, if you look at the playlist, look under answers to questions. And so I was asked a question not too long ago about the fact that in Matthew 13, verse 55, it mentions the brothers of Jesus. It mentions Jesus being the carpenter's son. It mentions his mother Mary, and it mentions his four brothers. And it also mentions his sisters as well. And one of the brothers' names is Joseph. And the questioner was asking that since Jewish men or Jewish fathers did not name their sons after themselves, in other words, their sons were not given their names. So if you have Simon has a son. The questioner is saying that the Jewish father would not give his son the name Simon. In other words, there were no juniors. There were no Simon Juniors, and there were no Tony Juniors, and so forth and so on. And so the questioner was saying, well, how could this brother of Jesus by the name of Joseph, he can't be Joseph's son, because the Jewish practice was for Jewish men to name their sons after other people or using other names other than their own. And so the argument that this person was proposing was that since Jesus is said to have a brother by the name of Joseph, that couldn't really be Joseph's son, because Joseph would not have named him after himself, because this would go against this Jewish custom. Now, of course, people who usually ask this type of question or use this form of argumentation usually fall in either the Roman Catholic camp or the Orthodox camp, including, I would also include here, the Orientalist churches like the Coptic Church and others, the Assyrian Church of the East and so forth. Many of these arguments are usually put forward by people who want to defend the perpetual virginity of Mary. That is to say that Mary remained a virgin before Christ was born, and while she carried the Christ child, and even after postpartum, that is after birth, that Mary remained a virgin. Now, as an evangelical Protestant, I don't hold to that view. I believe Mary and Joseph had their own biological children after Jesus was born. Was Mary a virgin before she conceived Christ? Absolutely, 100%. Evangelical Protestants would absolutely agree with that. Was she a virgin while she carried the Christ child? Absolutely. Her virginity was maintained in her pregnancy because she conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit, not by any male involvement in marriage and so forth. She was not married at the time. She was betrothed to Joseph. Now, do evangelical Protestants believe that Mary remained a virgin after she gave birth to Christ? And most evangelical Protestants today would say no. Joseph and Mary had their own children, and therefore she did not remain a virgin. We take Matthew 1:25 that says that he did not know her, that is, Joseph did not have sexual relations with Mary until she brought forth her firstborn son, that is Jesus. Now, that is not to say that there have not been other Protestants in history who would maintain perpetual virginity of Mary. John Wesley, for example, although he comes later in the English Reformation, John Wesley was a Protestant who held that Mary remained a virgin. Is this a hill to die on? No. Is this a fundamental of the Christian faith? No. And so if you are inclined to believe as a Protestant that Mary remained a virgin after giving birth to Jesus, that does not affect your salvation. It may affect your interpretation of various passages in the New Testament that speak about the brethren or the brothers of Jesus and so forth, even naming them. But overall, it doesn't have any significant impact on your salvation. Now, if you're interested in the discussion on the perpetual virginity of Mary. I'm putting a link in the description box where I have a YouTube interview that I had on the very question of the perpetual virginity of Mary. And so if you're interested in checking that out, please look in the description box and click on that video, and it will take you to that discussion on the perpetual virginity of Mary. Now, the passages that I want us to look at today in question, there's some interesting questions here that we want to look at. And we want to look at this passage. Let me just, sorry about that, folks. Let me just bring up my share again, my share screen. Just 1 minute here, bring her up. There we go. One of the passages in question, and I want to discuss some of these variants here. We want to look, first of all, at Matthew 13:55, and this is from the ESV, the English Standard Version. And there it says, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas?" So here in Matthew 13:55, Jesus is in Nazareth. He's teaching there with authority, and the people in Nazareth, those who would have been his neighbors, are asking, they're really questioning where he derives this authority to teach and preach. And so they ask the question, is this not the carpenter's son? Which would imply the fact that Joseph is not outrightly mentioned here would imply for us that Joseph is no longer alive at this time. Now, remember, the readers of Matthew know about the virgin birth story from Matthew 1:18 into chapter 2 of Matthew. They already are aware that Jesus was not biologically the son of Joseph, but Jesus would have been the legal son of Joseph, in terms of Joseph being his stepfather. But then it asks, is not his mother called Mary? The implication, the implied answers here are yes and yes. And then they mention these brothers by the name of James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. So according to Matthew 13:55, you have 4 brothers mentioned here: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. And Judas there sometimes is translated as Jude in some translations, or Jude is a short form, an anglicized form of Judas. And you will know from the New Testament canon itself that we do have 2 letters written by 2 brothers of the Lord, and one of them is James, who is the one first mentioned here, and the other one would be Judas, or Jude, as we have it in our New Testament Bibles, New Testament translations. And so James and Judas are brothers of the Lord. And you'll notice there's 2 others by the name of Joseph and Simon. Now, when the person asked me the question, how could this Joseph, who is mentioned here in verse 55 of Matthew 13, how could this Joseph be the actual son of Joseph, that is the husband of Mary, since Jewish fathers did not name their sons after themselves? And so the argument that is being implied here is that if Joseph was the father of these 4 children, that is the biological father, then Joseph would not have named one of his sons after himself, that is Joseph. And so the argument is these are really not the brothers of Jesus, biological brothers, but they are kinsmen or cousins, as the Roman Catholics would argue, or they are half-brothers of Jesus, as the Orthodox would argue that they were Joseph's children from a previous marriage. Now, let me just say that the presupposition that Jewish fathers in the first century did not name their sons after themselves, I will argue that that is an inaccurate view, and is based on a later understanding of Jewish practice that is being read back into the New Testament. But let me just point out that the name Joseph there, you'll notice there's an asterisk there. So if you follow my cursor there, you'll notice there's an asterisk. And if we go down to the bottom here, we notice the Greek word there for Joseph is Yosef. And this appears in what's called the critical text, or the oldest text, the Alexandrian manuscripts of the New Testament. And so that is the name that you find in the critical text. That is to say, the oldest Alexandrian text. Now, when we look at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 3, this is the second quote here. You'll notice in Mark 6, verse 3, again, also from the ESV, the people are asking the question, is not this the carpenter? So notice here, Jesus is now identified by the same trade as his stepfather, Joseph, which would imply that Joseph trained him in his own trade, which again was very common. So Jesus also became a carpenter like his stepfather Joseph. But then it asks the question, is he also not the son of Mary? Notice they don't call him the son of Joseph. He's called the son of Mary, which implies there's an implication in Jewish practice that when you name a son after his mother, the implication is that there's some question about his legitimacy, that is, about the legitimacy of his birth. Now, if you're interested in a full-scale discussion on this, I would encourage you, look in the description box. There's a link there to an interview I had with my good friend Anthony Rogers, where we had a video, a very long video rather, on a defense of the virgin birth of Christ. And we go into details about this phrase, the son of Mary. But then it mentions, notice in the ESV, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. So notice that here we also have the sisters. So Jesus didn't just have brothers, he also had sisters. Again, very common Jewish, in first century, of course, parents would have large families. So this is not surprising at all from a strictly biological point of view. But notice that in Mark's gospel, notice that the name Joseph is actually written as Joseph. And so we have 3 asterisks here. Let's go down to the bottom. You'll notice there's 3 asterisks here. And what we have in, again, the critical text or the Alexandrian manuscripts is you have the name Iosetos. And Iosetos is translated as Joseph in English. Now, why would Mark have Joseph and Matthew would have Joseph? Why would he have this variant? Now, they're not different names. They're actually variants. So Joseph would be a variant of Joseph. And this appears in Mark's gospel. So what that tells us is that the name Joseph in the first century did have a variant form. And so people could also be called Joseph as well. And the point being here that the question, of course, is, well, which one was it? Was it Joseph or was it Joseph? He could have been known by both names, just like someone by the name of Anthony or Antonio could also be known as Tony, or someone who is known as William could be known by his short form Bill, or Michael and Mike and so forth. So this appears to be a variant of the name Joseph. This is not anything overly significant. Is it possible that Joseph named his son Joseph instead of Joseph? It's possible. We don't know for sure, but these names are definitely variants of one another. Now, notice that in the last quote here from Matthew 13, verse 55, this is taken from the King James Version, and the King James Version is based on, this reading here is based on not the critical text, the Alexandrian manuscripts. This comes from another family of manuscripts that we call the majority text, sometimes the Byzantine text. And from that majority text, you get what's called later the Textus Receptus, from which you get the King James Version. It's the source of the King James Version. And so in Matthew 13, verse 55 of the King James Version, this is based on, again, another manuscript family. Notice it says, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. So notice that in the Byzantine majority text tradition, you will notice that it also has the name Joseph in that family of manuscripts. And if you look at the double asterisks here at the bottom of the screen, you have the name Yoses. And so the Yoses, again, this reading appears in the majority text. It appears in the Textus Receptus. And that is why you see the King James translates it as Yoses, because the underlying name here is Yoses. So this is something like, for example, you'll see this mostly in Portuguese and Spanish traditions or cultures. So the name Joseph in Portuguese is José, Jose, and in Spanish it's written the same way, but it's pronounced Jose. And so this shortened form of Joseph has entered into various languages, particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish cultures, Spanish languages, as Jose or as Jose. So again, these are simply variants of the name Joseph. So he could have been called Joseph, he could have been called Joseph, he could have gone by both names. But the main critique here is, well, there's this Jewish practice that Jewish men did not name their children after themselves. Fathers did not name their sons after themselves, but not so fast. There is evidence to suggest that indeed in the first century, there was a practice of fathers naming their children after themselves. So one of the clearest examples is found in Luke chapter 1, verses 59 to 60. And in Luke chapter 1, verses 59 to 60, we have the recounting here of the birth of John the Baptist. And in this passage, it speaks about the circumcision of John the Baptist and his naming. So here we read, and on the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, that's John the Baptist, and they would have called him Zechariah after his father, but his mother answered, no, he shall be called John. So notice here in Luke chapter 1, the child, John, when he is born, they were going to call him Zechariah after his father. Now, why would they do this if this was not the practice within Judaism? Why would they do this if fathers did not name their children after themselves? Well, clearly, Luke tells us that fathers would in fact, name their children after themselves. And so the people were going to call him Zechariah after his father. And if you remember at this point in the story, Zechariah is still mute because of his doubting of the angel Gabriel's announcement that he would have a son. He's still mute. And if you read on, it says that the Lord restored his language, his tongue back to Zechariah, and he confirmed what Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, said, that his name shall be called John. The point, however, is that this text shows us that the practice of naming a son after his father is not foreign to Jewish practice. In fact, it's being clearly shown that it was actually normal in the first century. And so when someone says, well, the Joseph mentioned in Matthew 13:55 could not be Joseph's son because Jewish fathers did not name their sons after themselves, you need to explain this passage here in Luke 1:59 to 60, where it clearly shows that Jewish fathers would indeed name their children after themselves. Hence, why would the people here want to name Zechariah after his father? Now, we do have evidence outside of the New Testament in Jewish writings that Jewish people would be named after their fathers. If we look at Josephus, the first century Jewish historian and writer who would have been contemporary with the Apostle Paul, for example, first century AD. And here he talks about this man by the name of Judas. Notice he says, now when Judas, the son of Judas, who was one of Simon's under officers and a person entrusted by him to keep one of the towers, saw this procedure of Simon's, he called together 10 of those under him that were most faithful to him. Now, I don't have to go into the rest of the quote here, but this has to do with the Maccabean Wars, the Wars of the Maccabees, where the story of Hanukkah comes from. But suffice it to say that notice here in this story that there's a Jewish man by the name of Judas, a very good Jewish name, Judas or Judah. We saw this was also one of the names of the Lord in Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6, verse 3. But notice that Josephus refers to him as Judas, the son of Judas, which would mean that this Jewish man was named after his father. This is first century, and Josephus does not critique this. He doesn't protest this practice. He simply records it as if it's normal. In another part of Josephus's writing, Josephus' Antiquities, he says, but there was a certain friend of Hyrcanus, an Idumean, and this is actually a reference to Herod. Now, what is interesting here is Josephus tells us, the New Testament does not, but Josephus tells us that Herod was actually an Idumean. That is, he was an Edomite. He came from Edom. And thanks to Josephus, we know this about Herod. Other than Josephus, just the New Testament alone, we wouldn't know this. But here it says there was a certain friend of Hyrcanus, an Idumean, called Antipater, who was very rich and in his nature an active and a seditious man. Now, if you look down to the bottom, it goes on to say, but that assertion of his was to gratify Herod, who was his son, and who by certain revolutions of fortune came forward to be king of the Jews. So here you get the background to Matthew 2, where Herod is called the king. Herod was given that title by the emperor, more of a puppet king. He's not a real king. Only the emperor was the real king. And so here, Herod is being described as a king of the Jews, a puppet king. Notice that phrase, king of the Jews, that becomes very prominent in the New Testament, in the nativity account of Matthew 2, and also in the crucifixion scene where Jesus is given the title king of the Jews. That title is above his head. And then it says, he came afterward to be king of the Jews, whose history we shall give you in its proper place hereafter. However, this Antipater was at first called Antipas, and that was his father's name also. So notice that Antipater here was at first called Antipas. His name was Antipas, and that was also his father's name. So even though Herod was an Idumean, an Edomite, it's important to realize that even though Edomites were not, strictly speaking, they were not really Jews, because Jews would have to come from the line of Isaac, Edom was still a descendant of Abraham, because Esau was the son of Isaac. Remember, Esau and Jacob were twin brothers. So the point here is that even among the Idumeans, there was a practice of naming their sons after their fathers. And finally, looking at Josephus' Jewish Wars, he's talking here about the siege of Jerusalem before AD 70. And Josephus says, the best esteemed also of the high priests, Jesus, the son of Gamaliel. Notice Jesus was a very common Jewish name. And Annas, the son of Ananus, when they were at their assemblies, bitterly reproached the people for their sloth and excited them against the zealots. For that was the name they went by, as if they were zealous in good undertakings and were not rather zealous in the worst actions and extravagant in them beyond the example of others. So the point here, Josephus here is mentioning the siege of Jerusalem by Titus and the Roman general Titus prior to AD 70, the destruction of the Second Temple. And here he speaks of the high priests, and he mentions two of them, Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, and Ananus, the son of Ananus. So please notice that even one of the high priests, Ananus, that we read about in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, we read here that Ananus was the son of Ananus. Now, these are high priests who would be steeped in Jewish law. And yet here we have one named after his father. And so the idea then that Jewish people did not name their children after themselves, that is, fathers would not name their children after themselves, is really a claim that has no basis in the New Testament and in sources outside of the New Testament. So we've seen not only in the New Testament with Luke 1:59-60, and in, of course, the writings of Josephus, we've seen that indeed it was common for Jewish men to name their sons after themselves. And so the claim that Joseph, the husband of Mary, the claim that Joseph could not have named one of his sons after himself is basically unfounded. He could indeed have named one of his sons after himself. And in fact, I hold to the position that he did. And this is in keeping with, again, what we just saw in Luke 1:59-60 and the writings of Josephus. Now, the problem, of course, is when we start reading later Jewish practices or later Jewish developments back into the first century writings. And so we know, for example, that among the Sephardic Jews, so Sephardic Jews would be Mediterranean Jews, the Middle East, all the way west into Spain. They're known as Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews do name their children, usually not after their fathers, but they would name them after their grandparents while they're still alive. And so Sephardic Jews, particularly grandparents, when they have a grandson, it gives them great joy to know that their son is being named after the grandfather. So this practice goes on today among Sephardic Jews. Now, the Ashkenazic Jews, that is Jews in the Eastern European parts of the world, do not name their children after living family members, but they will only name them after deceased relatives, usually grandparents. And so the practice then of naming children after living relatives, as I pointed out, is something that you find among the Sephardic Jews, but this again has to do with grandparents. But we need to be very careful here. We need to be careful we don't read later developments back into the first century. This is known as eisegesis, reading into the passage what is not there. And even the practice of naming male children, or the practice of naming sons after themselves, the practice of naming sons after themselves, as we've seen, is totally acceptable within the New Testament. But the practice of naming children, male children at their circumcision, is not attested outside of the Bible. It's not attested in Jewish sources until the 8th century AD. And therefore, even the very practice of naming children. Now, clearly, we are told in Luke 1, chapter 1, verses 59 to 60, that John was named at his circumcision. And in Luke 2:22, we have Jesus also being named at his circumcision. Outside of the New Testament, the practice of naming children, male children at their circumcision, is not attested until you get to the 8th century AD. So here we have a practice already established in the New Testament of naming male children at their circumcision, but it's not attested outside of the New Testament, outside of the Bible, in Jewish sources, until you get to the 8th century AD, that is the 700s. So all of that to say, we need to be careful that we read certain texts and practices within their own historical context, and that we don't use later developments to interpret previous ones. And so I hope that this has been an edifying video. I hope it's been educational, and I hope it's answered the question about whether or not Joseph would have named a son after himself. The answer is yes, he would. And we have evidence for that within the New Testament texts themselves. And so, folks, as usual, please don't forget to subscribe to Toronto Apologetics. Don't forget to like the video and to share the video as well. So until next time, Tony Costa, wishing you all a happy new year. Take care and God bless. Bye for now.